First of all, a very warm welcome and many thanks for coming to Steve's celebration of life. A tribute really to him that so many of you turned out. Yes, his official name was Cyril W., but no one dare call him Cyril for fear of being chastised severely. He was called only Steve Stevens, and he let you know that in no uncertain terms. Steve had a very sharp wit, usually with a joke or one-liner, as only a Brit could while smiling. Yes, Steve was resilient. He recovered well from the many falls he had this past year without any broken bones. Yes, Steve listened to what you had to say instead of thinking about what he was going to say next. He was more interested in asking you about what was going on in your life as opposed to rambling on about his own.
I first met Steve 35 years ago when I applied for a job with the Ontario Tennis Association, and Steve was part of the 3-person selection committee. It should be noted that I didn't get the job. Over the next 35 years, I shared this common connection with Steve as I would enjoy every time I saw him, reminding him of what a mistake he made. Of course, thankfully for me, he eventually agreed, and ultimately I did end up working at the OTA. And in those days, the board of directors was known as the governing council. And Steve was an active member of that council. And for many of you who have had the pleasure to listen to his famous speeches, you would have enjoyed those times. The group of 4, as I called them, Roy Mansell, Jerry Ronan Sr., Jim Heather, and Steve Stevens, collectively had an incredible gift of how to use the English language. And the 4 of them relished debating the issues of the day. It was like watching British parliamentarians on both sides of the aisle trying to outdo each other. And as a staff member, I would sit at the back of the room and smile at the usage of words that most of us had no idea what they meant. Having a dictionary nearby was a requirement because Steve was clearly a gifted speaker.
He came to Bob Moffat in 1988 at Tennis Canada and said, you need a seniors department, and I'm your guy, I'll run it for you. Bob said, what a great idea. We're just not quite ready for it. But 3 years later, Robert Bettauer, who was running tennis development for Tennis Canada, recruited Steve to run the seniors team and run seniors tennis. Steve has been with Tennis Canada ever since, 25 years. He grew seniors tennis. He was a force to be reckoned with. He made a difference. When he came into the offices, you knew it. He was a personality, and he was strong-willed. His annual birthday celebrations at the office, when we cut the cake and sing happy birthday, was not to be missed because he would speak, and he was eloquent, and he was articulate, he was funny, he was witty, and he was brutally honest. He made a huge difference to our sport, and especially seniors tennis.
I asked him, what kind of cookies do you like? And I'll make them for you. And his response was, well, oatmeal raisins, but no chocolate. Well, recently, Wendy Tobias tells me that he loved chocolate. And she told me this at his bedside in Sunnybrook. And I bet he had her making him oatmeal chocolate chip cookies. Maybe he called Wendy an angel too. Every time I came with the cookies, I was an angel. And maybe he even overheard us on that day talking about his likes and dislikes of cookies. But he was still sharp, and he heard everything we said. Perhaps what helps us to live long lives is to do what Steve did. His wit and his quick mind were fueled by his training at bridge, solving crossword puzzles and challenges on Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, which were his favorite programs, and of course on the tennis court. I will always remember the day we emptied his condo. I knew he was agitated, so I gave him the day's crossword puzzle which I had started. He took up the challenge, almost completed it, but not without a dig by telling me that I had more than a few wrong. George, Steve is waiting to challenge you on the tennis court, a badminton court, or a squash court, or even a golf course. And someday that might just happen. Don't you agree all that it would be a great match for us to watch and bet on? Because I think Steve would like us to bet on his winning. He was sure a winner here.
But quite frankly, my connection with Mr. Stevens, as I then called him, dates all the way back to when he was the manager of this club in 1969, when he joined the lawn then. Those were different times, of course. Those were simple times in the world generally, and most certainly here at the lawn. I recall being here day in and day out in the summer as a teenager. Steve would maybe put in a few hours handling his duties as general manager, overseeing an office staff of 2, Kit Snow, whom I'm so pleased to see today, and Ina May Head. Truth be told, they did all the work. Then you would find him out on the tennis court, maybe playing doubles with some others, decked out not so much in the whites we see today, but in those cream-colored tennis shorts that remind us so much of the history and the tradition of our sport. Back to work shortly afterward for a bit, but this is why he was the perfect manager for the Toronto Lawn in that day and age. He mingled with the members, he socialized with members, he played with the members, he became one of us. Well, or in my young eyes, he was one of them. And so it came to that day in the early 1980s when he asked if I could do him just a small favor. He had scored some tickets to Wimbledon, but he wouldn't be able to take up that ticket offer unless he could get someone else to take his place running the Ontario Senior Mixed Doubles just this once. He had been running the tournament since the late 1960s. I had no idea what seniors tennis was. This was in the day when I think they were called veterans. And men were 45 and women were 40. I was 20 years away from all that. Well, I guess you know where the story goes. 2016 will be my 34th year filling in for Steve Stevens. So to say that Steve owes me one is a bloody understatement. But he remained on, though, as honorary chairman of the tournament. And of course, as you've all heard, he just regaled the crowds annually with a speech at the tournament dinner dance on Saturday evenings until he was 97 years of age. Although the speech, truth be told, was pretty much the same every year, he never failed to get the crowd laughing and earn a well-deserved standing ovation at the end. When due to ill health just a couple of years ago, he had to skip the dinner speech, we lost something special. He was immensely proud when the tournament that he was so instrumental in starting and maintaining just a couple of years ago, as you know, was named the Tennis Canada Senior Event of the Year. To the best of my memory, he only played in the tournament once in all my involvement. And although I can't remember the details, I can guarantee you he lost in the first round. As you've seen him say, he was cannon fodder. First round cannon fodder. But nevertheless, he was still our champion. If nothing else, the tournament will live on in his memory. In fact, as many of you may know, the primary trophy of the tournament is named in his memory. And I'm proud to have followed in his footsteps as chairman, even if he hoodwinked me into doing so. So Steve has now crossed the pearly gates. No doubt he's again organizing some seniors event, all those folks dressed in white. When I finally arrive, if Steve Stevens should ask me, just that 1 year to run that event, I'm going to tell him to go to hell.
Steve never saw a microphone that he didn't want to use or give up. By the way, I called him CWS. I got away from Steve Stevens, and he didn't mind. He let me actually do it. I used to do it up at the tennis center, and he'd just give me a grisly look and say, okay, fine. I met Steve when I was 17 years old. I was a member at the Toronto Lawn. He'd just become the manager And I thought I was a pretty hotshot tennis player. I was a junior champ at the time. And then this English gentleman just grabbed me and said, "I'm the new manager. My name is Steve Stevens. You better make sure that you wear white all the time." And I just went, who is this guy? I left that day. My dad picked me up and I was in the car. I said, "Dad, I got to make sure my mom, make sure I have a lot of white shorts and white shirts. There's this new guy at the lawn that's watching us like crazy." Well, that was my first exposure to Steve Stevens. I actually came back as the senior tennis professional in 1980, and I was here for 10 years. He was here for about 2 of those 10, and I enjoyed Steve immensely. He taught me a lot of things about administration. He was a very clever man. He used to have an office, for the older people here, you'll know, that office was right over there where I think the cloakroom is now. And he used to reign supreme here along with Kit Snow, Mrs. Snow.
His life, as other people this evening have already mentioned, read like a Hollywood novel. He had a bigger-than-life presence. Even in his later years, a presence so big, he really didn't need 2 names like everybody else. I had the pleasure of meeting Steve when I joined the Seniors Committee. I brought my computer to the first meeting and took notes, which is what I always do, not realizing that he typically took the minutes of the meeting. He did not seem to mind me much, unwittingly taking over his duties, but was quick to point out to me the importance of using people's full names when attributing comments to members of the committee. This was the start of a great relationship, as he and I took great delight in debating the various issues that came up at committee meetings. As is not uncommon in committees, people brought a disparity and diversity of thoughts which were not always aligned with Steve's view of the world. He would be very quick to point out the error of their ways and with decreasing levels of patience explain why they were wrong. His logic was always flawless, and there was never any doubt about the sharp mind and intelligence resident within his body.
And it's really hard to know where to begin. First off, any gentleman, and I use that word loosely like Steve would have, not wearing a suit and tie tonight, you had a lot of guts to come dressed that way. For those of you who were present on that Sunday morning last October at the Toronto Lawn, you know what I mean. You were most fortunate as you heard Steve's last speech. And boy, was he in fine form when he won the prestigious Steve King Award, which best exemplifies the spirit of the Toronto Lawn Tennis Club. It's not easy for me to speak about Steve with him not being here to listen to me. When someone reaches the ripe old age of 99, it's like they're invincible. And you think, well, they're always going to be here. Of course, that's not the case. But for me, it's hard to believe. Sorry, that this guy has come and he's here. He's not here anymore. I was driving down Don Mills this evening and turned right on Overley. My car wanted to turn left, but I wasn't picking him up tonight.
This evening. In 1984, Tennis Canada decided that tennis was for life. And they put a lot of money into juniors, and now they were going to put some money into seniors. So they had a meeting in Toronto, and they brought people from across Canada, 1 person, I think, from each province. So there were about 10 men, 2 women, myself and Muffy. And so we had this meeting, and Tennis Canada was going to support 4 senior teams before the teams had gone on their own. But now they were going to be supported. So there was a big discussion, and the men said, okay, we're going to send the 45, 55, 65, and 75 men's teams. Steve stood up and said, no, we are sending 2 men's teams and 2 women's teams. So another big discussion. And somebody, I don't know who was there, I think Brendan Macken was, but if anybody was there at this 1984 senior meeting, let me know, because I can't remember. Anyway, they had a big discussion. The men won the day, and they said, right, we're sending 4 men's teams. Steve stood up the second time, and he said, no, we are sending 2 men's teams and 2 women's teams. So I sat down, another big discussion, and the men, whoever, I can't remember who it was who was representing the men, stood up and said, we are sending 4 men's teams. For the 3rd time, Steve stood up and said, no, we are not. We're sending 2 men's teams, 2 women's teams, and they accepted it. And the next year, in 1985, I was lucky to be on the Young Cup team. So after that meeting, because of Steve, the women got to go. We might have taken a few years before we got to go. But anyway, I've got to thank Steve for all that he did for the women. So from the Canadian women.